Hi, I'm Sue Klapper. I'm a professor in the Doctor of Physical Therapy program here at UTMB. The research I'll be presenting in Boston involves the Kawa Model, and it's looking at applying the Kawa Model to the student experience during the time of COVID. And it acts as a metaphor for kind of their lived experience at that time. And we looked at 3 different cohorts: the class of 2020, class of 2021, and class of 2022. And through exit interviews, students created the Kawa Model picture, and we were able to analyze the different components of that and how each of their different experiences were influenced by the time of COVID. So this research is important in understanding the student experience because there were so many things that disrupted teaching and learning during the time of COVID, with the immediate shutdown and then the pivot to online learning. And that was a challenge for faculty who had never taught online perhaps before, but also just so many adjustments. The isolation the students were experiencing really did influence their learning. In physical therapy, a lot of what we do is physical, it's hands-on, and students were pulled into their isolated home environments to try to learn, and it was very disruptive to the flow of their learning. The Kawa Model uses a river as a metaphor for human life. You can look at it in 2 ways. You can start with the river starting up in the mountains and then flowing down out into the ocean, and that's your whole lifespan. Or you can take a snapshot looking at a cross-section of the river, and there are certain constructs of that cross-section of that river that, in this case, the students could use to describe their experience. So things like, what was the riverbed like? That's sort of like the structure of maybe their educational process. Are they in the classroom, in the lab, or are they pulled more into the remote settings that they experienced during COVID? What was the structure of the curriculum like? And then students were asked to identify what are some challenges, which are the boulders in the river, and those could be barriers or difficulties they're experiencing. And then they're asked to identify some of their personal assets and gifts and things that are working well, and that's the driftwood. So, and then we look at the whole flow of the river and how much space there is. If the riverbed is cluttered with lots of rocks and boulders, it's not ideal for learning. There's not a lot of learning flow happening. And if there are some driftwoods, that's great. But I do know the class of 2022 created a picture where they had very little driftwood. They didn't even see their own strengths and assets. And in fact, this whole project kind of came out of another project we're doing where we looked at compassion satisfaction and compassion fatigue with students, faculty members, and clinical instructors. And the interesting thing was, again, that study was the students were struggling during the time of COVID. They had compassion fatigue, but the faculty and the clinical instructors had developed coping strategies so they could cope better. We didn't explore the Kawa method with those groups, but we did with the students. And for the class of 2020, we saw that physical therapy is hard. There are some barriers. There's always going to be some boulders, but those students were able to identify some of the driftwood that were their assets and their maybe their grit or their resilience. And the class of 2021 had finished most of their didactic work. They did pick up on some of the challenges with the clinical placements, but they had some boulders and they had a lot of driftwood as well. But it was the class of 2020 that everything seemed to plug up that river flow. There were so many boulders in the flow and very little driftwood, things that they felt resilient about. They felt very beat down, and there was not a lot of flow for their lived experience of going through physical therapy school. So I think the really cool thing was the Kawa allows a visual representation of what our students were going through at the time. The study used qualitative methods to gather data from the students through some guided questions we asked about what they were experiencing as they left the program, as they reflected back on their time in the program. And then we created the pictures with them. But the questions are, tell me about what was great for you, what worked well in the program, what things were challenges, What things did you see, as assets? And we just would go through the process of asking those kinds of questions, very open-ended, and then create the diagram with them and coming to consensus on the diagram. So going back to our diagrams that we created with the students, we were able to see that for the class of 2020, they were pretty much through with their whole physical therapy education. I think the pivot to online learning happened in March of 2020, so they had finished their didactic classroom experiences and most of their clinical education experiences. They just had to get it through the last few weeks of the school year. So I almost look at that diagram as kind of being the control group, even though we don't have a control group in the studies design, but that's kind of what a standard PT program student might experience. Then we move into the class of 2021, where they did all their foundational sciences and clinical science didactic coursework. They had done maybe one of their clinical experiences, but the whole last maybe 9 months or so of their clinical experiences were left. And there were challenges with finding placements for students, especially in acute care. There were challenges with access to clinics, needing to be vaccinated, and that sort of thing. So they had a few extra boulders in their riverbed drawing compared to the class of 2020. They still had a very good sense of self and their self-resilience and their reason for wanting to be a physical therapist. They saw the possibilities. They were not overwhelmed with what was going on with COVID at the time. And so their river flow was open and flowing despite having some barriers, and there were some pretty good driftwoods floating down the river as well, you might say. Now the class of 2022, they seemed to be hit the hardest because they had just started. They'd maybe gone, most of their first year probably in whatever format they had intended to start, which in the case of this one particular program was a residential program, face-to-face classes and labs. And then suddenly COVID hit in March of 2020, where the schools were shut down, and everybody had to adapt really, really fast. Well, then they had to continue learning in an online format. Faculty in the meantime had been brought up to speed with some teaching certificates for online teaching, but weren't perfect at it, I'm sure. And the students weren't perfect at having to learn online either. So there's a lot of ongoing learning about learning happening. And so students would perceive more barriers, inaccessibility to labs. Students weren't allowed to campus oftentimes for class or lab experiences. They had to find someone in their family to practice on, maybe virtually, and demonstrate their skills, which was less than ideal. They perceived just a lot of challenge with not being able to get together in groups face-to-face, but they have to meet online to do group projects. So there are a lot of barriers. Despite that, though, the riverbed was nice and strong. It looked, they felt supported to a point, but they almost, more of them talked about wanting to give up in their exit interviews, and they weren't sure they would be able to make it to the end and through their board pass rates. I guess ultimately some of those students did report having to take the boards a couple times extra. Usually they get through it the first time, but that was a challenge for them. But it was just a very cluttered cross-section of a river that they drew. So the riverbed of the Kawa drawings really represents kind of the structure, the environment that the students are situated in. Things like how the faculty are they supportive? Does it feel like a family environment or not? Because that can be good or bad too, I suppose, depending on the family. But access to a good curriculum, strong faculty, access to some good facilities. Those were some of the things that were identified as kind of the riverbed that allowed them to flow with their learning. So the space in the river drawing represents that openness to flow and that life flow, and that things are going well. And so the cohort 2022, which was most impacted in their learning journey by COVID, was very cluttered. So they were dealing with a lot of barriers, trying to navigate how do you learn the material for PT school, but then how do you stay safe in society with this virus raging around them? How do you how do you get your work done? How do you not get distracted? And just that, I think it really represented that isolation and that inability to have optimal learning. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi talks about when you're in an optimal state of learning, you have this flow state where your challenge and your preparation to meet that challenge are equally met, and you're engaging in that learning activity and loving it so much that you kind of lose track of time. And so the students in the class of 2022 were just so overwhelmed with all the educational changes they had to deal with in learning that they felt pretty stalled out, kind of like the flow of the water when the riverbed's being dammed up. It's not flowing well. And so then I think that these drawings are helpful for faculty and administrators to look at, to figure out and work with the students to figure out, wow, these things we can change, but these things we can't change. So let's look at your driftwood. Let's look at your gifts and talents and your grittiness and things like that, your resilience. And let's see what boulders we can remove out of the river to make your life flow better, or your river flow better. The method came out of Japan, where Michael Iwama is a Canadian occupational therapist who developed it with his Japanese colleagues, and it's more of a metaphor for living, and it's not just black and white. This is good, this is bad, and this will change and this will stay the same, because it's understanding kind of the lived experience from the people going through whatever it is they're going through. And I think you can do focus groups and write notes and everything, but until you have that visual representation that depicts what people feel and believe their life is like at that moment, it's really true that a picture is worth 1,000 words, because that really helps you visualize what experiences are contributing to a good flow, and also what experiences are contributing to a bad flow based on the different structures they're adding to their picture, like the boulders or the driftwood, or the depiction of the riverbed. What does that look like? Or just the amount of water that's allowed to be there or not be there. Other programs might consider using the Kawa Model as they're assessing maybe the strengths and weaknesses of their programs or areas that they can improve. I think it provides a helpful pictorial view of the students' lived experiences, as opposed to just a list of things that are going well or not going well. And it also kind of really shows the interconnection of everything from the state of the program, how it's structured, what some of the challenges students are having, maybe in a regular PT program, but also maybe specific to that cohort, what was challenging when you compare across different pictures. And then also it can tell like what things are doing well. And I think as students move through a program, it's helpful for faculty advising. It would be a great strategy to help students assess how they're maybe doing in the first semester, and then maybe at the end of the program as well. It can be helpful for faculty to better understand what challenges students are facing and what some potential solutions might be, and they can work collaboratively with the students to design an intervention. Like maybe they need to think about how to take tests better, or maybe they need to figure out how to study better, study in collaboration with others. So that's on the student level, but it can also be helpful again on the programmatic level, where student or administrators or the faculty can look at the program as a whole and think about maybe some of the things they're doing or have been doing that may be good things to do in terms of pedagogy, but maybe you could tweak them a little to make them more meaningful to the students.